So welcome to EJIL Live, and I have with me Professor Hilary Charlesworth, who needs no introduction. And my first question, Hilary, is going to be a very obvious one. So you almost single-handedly really introduced and pioneered the whole issue of feminism and international law. And now it's, 20 years, 25 years later? Is it mission accomplished? Has it become mainstream? Now we're just filling in some gaps and holes?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say I certainly wasn't single-handed. And in a sense, I think the feminist project, as it were, is precisely only been possible because there have been so many different people working on it. And I think a lot of the ideas have emerged from discussion debate. I think it'd be extremely hard to go in and single-handedly. So I just want to say that initially.
In the perception of the world, it was four-handed.
Okay.
It was a recital for four hands.
Yeah,
but publishing in AJIL at the time was kind of, everybody had to sit back and take notice.
Yes, and looking back on that piece, sometimes I go back and I feel both dismayed by the tone of it and sometimes impressed by its preposterous confidence. So I have very mixed feelings when I go back and look at that. But the positive thing is I remember the friendships that brought that article together. So that's for me, that's the richest memory. But is it mission accomplished? I would say not at all. And I think that what we've found, I think that the article in the American Journal, that I remember Thomas Frank telling us that never in the history of that journal had an article been reviewed by so many reviewers because they got such polarized opinions on it. And I think that Tom Frank saw himself, with some justification, as having gone out on a limb to publish it. But that just really took, in quite a simple way, we never saw the authors of that. We didn't see ourselves as feminist theoreticians at all. We saw ourselves as international lawyers borrowing ideas like a magpie from other disciplines and applying them with, perhaps looking back, not very much sophistication to the issues. But I think you're absolutely correct that the language of feminism has certainly entered international institutions. So gender mainstreaming is a very popular concept. Yesterday at his keynote lecture at the Academy of European Law, Juan Mendez referred to gender issues as sort of thoroughly mainstream. But I think that what's been absorbed in the mainstream is a very weakened version of the question. So I think it very much now in international law we find this language, but I think the ideas, the feminist ideas, have been reduced to quite simplified and palatable ideas. So I actually think that, yes, the vocabulary has triumphed, but the actual political agenda behind the ideas hasn't.
But for example, today, no editor of a serious journal of international law in receiving sort of feminist international law with whatever level of radicalness would ever think that they were going out on a limb publishing it. So at least in that sense, you've accomplished a lot. I
think that's true. I don't think that's our accomplishment. I think because there's been a huge range of things put into it.
There's been a real change, at least in that respect.
That's true. It's been made respectable, and of course there are many courses taught on these issues in universities across the world, whereas that would have been 25 years ago, that would have been seen as impossible. So yes, I don't want to minimize the importance of those things, and you have people writing theses in this area and so on.
And I don't want to give the impression, okay, we can move on to other stuff as if we've solved that problem. No, not at all.
Yeah.
And I hear what you're saying, but at least the ability to speak and to be listened to and to engage is, I think we live in a different world now. And
I think that's true, but I would note that the two things, though, give me pause. One is the fact that in most international legal theory that's not explicitly feminist, you get no engagement with feminist ideas. So I think what's happened is that feminist thought in international law has become corralled really into a small number of people who discuss...
Like we've got environmental law and law of the sea, and so we've also got a subject, a little chapter in the casebook, and it's not really part of
the mainstream.
The mainstream.
Really. And I think that what we find is that the most interesting debates about feminism, it's completely in-house, as it were. So there's huge and I think quite important theoretical debates going on, but it's always feminists talking to each other.
What can we at EJIL, ESIL, EJIL Talk, EJIL Live do to change this?
Well,
to kind of help make what is, you say, in-house, to make it really mainstream rather than acceptable, but as you say, corralled.
Well,
do we have a role?
Yes, I think so. I would like to see such a prominent and important journal, for example, invite scholars, leading scholars of international law who've never written about feminism to engage with feminist theory in their areas. So I'd like to see Marty Koskiniemi, I'd like to see Jan Klubbers, I'd like to see a range of people who are critical thinkers in international law actually having to come to grips with feminist theory and thinking it through. That, I think, would be a very useful contribution.
That's important food for thought. We're having an editorial meeting in a few weeks, in a couple of weeks. I'm going to put that on the agenda because we should. I take this very, very seriously.
I once said to one of these thinkers, who should remain nameless, you've engaged with all of the great thinkers in legal theory generally, but you've never engaged with some of the major feminist theories. And your work is replete with references to Weber and to Marx and so on, but what about some of the really important feminist theorists? And they said, well, there weren't a lot of those books in my library. That was the answer. And I think that's to perhaps to begin that engagement, to require some of these people to really turn their minds to it and hopefully criticise the feminist work that's going on, engage with it, criticise it, take it seriously. I think that would be wonderful.
We're going to add this to our mission.
Okay.
Can I ask you one quick little question, totally changing tack? So, again, from where I said the number of submissions, the number of pieces we publish, etc., Australia and New Zealand are a powerhouse in international law, and yet they're so far away. How does that work for you? The ability to be part of the conversation, etc., and yet be on the other side of the world, so to speak.
Well,
I say this with a bit of irony and grin, so tongue-in-cheek. We are on the other side of the world, you could say.
Yes. Well, I think, and we've both countries got very small populations too, which is interesting. Well, first of all, I think perhaps one of the interesting things is to consider why are there so many people interested in international law in these very small countries and have a significant depth of expertise. And I think partly it's precisely because of our distance from what's seen to be the mainstream. And I think perhaps international law has seen to be an escape route, a bridge from one's rather isolated existence into other worlds. I think that's one possible theory, but I think it's a very interesting question. But I think it's managed by being, I think all the New Zealand and Australian international lawyers I know are great travellers, whereas meeting colleagues here, they just say, I'm sorry, I could never visit you because I could not face that 24-hour journey to your country, and even longer in the case of New Zealand. And whereas I think we think nothing about those long flights. So I think if you're a country with a significant European heritage and you're constantly looking towards Europe, you just take the travel in your stride and do it much more willingly. But I think it's interesting. I think it's quite interesting to me as an Australian who lives in Australia to actually watch the Australian New Zealand diaspora, because many of our finest international lawyers actually, sadly for those of us in Australia, or perhaps fortunately, I don't know, end up on the other side of the world. So they end up in the United States, they end up in the United Kingdom and Europe. And I think that in the 4 parts of the University of London, somebody told me that there was something like 23 Australian international lawyers. So I think it's good for the rest of the world, but I must say it's perhaps sad for those of us in Australia to think we're losing some of the most brilliant both of older generations but younger generations who perhaps see the centre more completely in Europe or the United States. But of course from Australia we see the centre quite differently, and we need them back in Australia now.
Well, I hope some of them at least are watching this. So Benedict, you've received...
Benedict, all is forgiven, come home.
You've received your marching. You've received the marching orders. Grant me that I've never thought of the distance as an impediment, and that's why I go quite regularly.
Yes, I think you are unusual in this, because even at the academy here, I've been speaking to various colleagues who tell me, you know, if there is a trip on the cards, they're dreading it and so on. No, but we have, and of course, we're really enriched by the connections of a number of very distinguished international lawyers who visit us regularly, and I think we'd find that tremendously enriching. But I wonder whether, and I've not thought about this, you know, that at some stage people will identify particular themes in the type of scholarship that's emerging in New Zealand and Australia. And I think it's perhaps the international law of the outsiders.
You know that we were once accused of not being the European Journal of International Law, but the Australian Journal of International Law.
Well, Philip Alston's made a similar comment, of course, about this whole summer school here, because he thinks there are far too many Australians for it to qualify as European. And, of course, many of us have a European heritage. So my great-grandfather migrated from the Valtellina to Australia. He was a penniless stonemason, and
I must tell you, I find the whole thing a bit laughable, because I'm nationality blind, so I sort of don't. It sometimes doesn't even register with me where they're from. Anyway, thank you very much, Hilary. It was great having you, and I thank all our viewers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.